My family had always favored my older brother, but the day they stripped me of the business I'd poured my life into, the pain hit like a gut punch I couldn't shake. It left me questioning every moment of loyalty I'd given them, feeling utterly discarded. We were gathered in the living room of our family home in Austin, Texas, the air thick with the scent of my mother's usual pot roast dinner that she'd insisted on making for this important talk. My mother sat at the head of the table. We'd pushed aside her posture straight as she laid out the papers, while my father nodded along without a word, his silence cutting deeper than any argument. "We've decided to transfer full ownership of the real estate firm to David," she said flatly, sliding the document toward me like it was just another bill to pay. "You've done enough, Victoria, but he's the one who can take it forward, family tradition, you understand." My brother David leaned back with a satisfied grin, his wife Lauren chiming in with a quick, "It's for the best," as if my 15 years of sweat meant nothing. The room spun for a second, my chest tightening with the weight of their casual dismissal, but I forced myself to stay calm and simply pushed the papers back, saying quietly, "If that's what you want, go ahead and sign it all over to him." They had no clue about the storm brewing beneath my composure, one that would force me to redefine what family really meant. If this kind of family drama resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. What would you do if your own blood turned on you like this? I'd love to hear your thoughts. My name is Victoria Lang. I am 35 years old. Growing up as the younger daughter in our household, I learned early on that love came with conditions, especially when it involved proving my worth over and over. My parents, Elizabeth and John Lang, ran a small real estate development firm here in Austin, started by my grandfather decades ago, and from the time I was a teenager, I was the one who showed interest in keeping it alive. My older brother David was always off chasing his own ideas, partying through college, starting failed side hustles, but I stuck around graduating high school early and jumping straight into helping with the books. The client calls, the endless paperwork that nobody else wanted to touch. By 19, I'd married my high school sweetheart, Caleb Weston, and we had our son, Oliver, a year later. But even then, I balanced motherhood with propping up the family business, turning it from a struggling local outfit into something that actually turned a profit. My grandmother, Mildred Lang, bless her soul, had always whispered in my ear about having my own security, so I kept a separate savings from my early part-time jobs, never mixing it with the firm's accounts. But over the years, the small slights built up like cracks in a foundation you don't notice until the whole structure shifts. My mother would praise David's occasional visits to the office as fresh energy, while my daily grind got a pat on the back at best, often followed by a reminder that I should focus more on being a wife and mom. My father, quiet as ever, would agree with whatever she said, his way of keeping peace. That really just meant avoiding the hard conversations. When Oliver was little, they'd spoil David with family trips I wasn't invited to, saying it was brother-sister bonding, even though Lauren, his wife now, was already in the picture back then. I'd brush it off, telling myself it was just how things were, but each time it chipped away at me, making me question if I was ever truly seen as equal in their eyes. Then, about 3 years ago, while reconciling the firm's accounts late one night after everyone else had gone home, I stumbled on something that made my stomach drop, the kind of discovery that rewires how you see your own blood. The numbers didn't add up at first, just a few odd transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. But as I dug deeper, pulling reports and cross-checking invoices, the picture emerged clear and ugly. The business was buried under layers of debt my parents had hidden from me, a second mortgage on the office building for $200,000, lines of credit maxed out at $150,000, unpaid vendors stacking up to $90,000, even equipment leases with balloon payments looming. Total owed was pushing $1.2 million, while the actual value of our properties and assets hovered around $900,000. We were underwater by $300,000, give or take. And where had it gone? Scattered across bad investments my father had chased, like cryptocurrency bets that tanked for $80,000, gambling losses traced to online accounts in his name for $50,000. Even personal expenses funneled through the firm, like luxury watches and trips I was never told about. My mother had signed off on most of it, her signature right there on the loan docs, all while they'd let me believe we were thriving, using my work to keep the facade going. I remember sitting there in the dim office light, surrounded by stacks of printouts, my hands shaking as I pieced it together. My first urge was to storm home and confront them, demand answers for how they could risk everything I'd helped build. But I held back, thinking of Oliver and how a blow-up might shatter what little stability we had. Instead, I started protecting what was mine. Following my grandmother's old advice, I had my inheritance from her $340,000 kept separate in my name and my retirement savings from early jobs about $180,000. With help from my uncle Frank Dorsey, a retired accountant who lived across town, I set up an irrevocable trust for Oliver, funneling it all in there, so it was untouchable, named only for his future. No beneficiaries for me or anyone else in the family. Then I documented everything, quietly copies of every shady transaction, every hidden loan, stashed in a safe deposit box and with my sister-in-law's cousin Amanda, who I'd befriended outside the family circle, and who promised to keep them safe without asking too many questions. For those 3 years I played along smiling at family dinners while watching the hole deepen. My parents kept making decisions without me, like taking out another small loan for expansions that never happened, and David would drop in occasionally talking big about his visions for the firm without lifting a finger. My best friend Nora Finley, who'd known me since college, would listen to my vague complaints over coffee. But little things started feeling off, like how details I'd shared with her about fighting for more say in the business would come back, twisted through my mother, making me sound ungrateful. It hit me one day when David mentioned a neighborhood I'd told Nora I was scouting for new properties, claiming it as his idea. She'd been feeding them info, probably hoping to curry favor since she'd always had a soft spot for my brother's charm. The violations piled up, my mother criticizing my management style in front of clients, my father dismissing my suggestions in meetings, even Lauren joining in with snide comments about how I was too involved, while she redecorated the office reception without asking. Each one stung, but I waited, knowing the pressure was building towards something bigger. The turning point came 6 months ago during one of those mandatory family meetings my mother loved to call always, under the guise of unity. We'd gathered at their house on the outskirts of Austin, the kind of sprawling ranch-style place that looked impressive, but I now knew was leveraged to the hilt. Oliver was there too, at 15 old enough to sense the tension but young enough to hope it was nothing. My parents sat us down after dinner, papers in hand, and my mother launched right in with that business-like tone she used for closing deals. "We've been thinking about the future of the firm," she said, not even looking at me directly. "David's ready to step up fully, so we're restructuring ownership to him house vehicles tied to the business, all of it. You can keep helping if you want, Victoria, but it's time he leads." My father just murmured agreement, avoiding my eyes, while David nodded like it was his due, and Lauren patted his arm supportively. Amanda, my cousin who'd tagged along at my invite for family support, shifted uncomfortably but stayed quiet, her presence a small anchor for me in the moment. It felt like the floor dropped out the business I'd sacrificed weekends and late nights for the one that paid for Oliver's school, and our modest life with Caleb handed over like I was just temporary help. The emotional coercion kicked in immediately, my mother leaning on guilt about family legacy, and how I should want what's best for everyone, gaslighting me into thinking my objections were selfish. "You've had your time," she added, her words laced with that underlying contempt she'd always harbored, like I was the afterthought child who overreached. David piled on with a sarcastic jab. "Come on, sis. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We all know I'm the one with the big ideas." The room went silent after that, my family's united front against me. Crystal clear, their biases laid bare and how easily they erased my contributions. I could have fought right there, spilled the truth about the debts, but instead I swallowed the rage and said softly, "Fine. If that's what you all think is fair, I'll step back." Little did they know that concession was the start of my quiet unraveling from them. The weeks that followed were a blur of escalating dismissals. My mother started locking me out of the office systems, claiming it was to smooth the transition, while my father avoided my calls, his silence a confirmation that he'd always seen me as secondary. David paraded his new control around changing vendors I'd negotiated with and criticizing my past decisions in emails copied to everyone, including our business partner Mike Thompson, a longtime associate I'd brought in years ago who now awkwardly sided with them to keep his stake secure. Nora kept checking in with fake concern, but her questions always circled back to what I planned next, info that somehow reached my family within days. Even Oliver felt the pull, with David dropping by to take him out for uncle time, filling his head with stories about how I was making things difficult by not fully supporting the change. My son started distancing himself, confused and torn, asking why I wasn't fighting harder. And that hurt more than any financial loss, the way my family's manipulation seeped into my own home. I hired Julia Hayes, a sharp lawyer from my old network, to review the situation. She laid it out plainly. You've built this Victoria, you're entitled to fight for your share. But I hesitated, thinking of the binders I'd compiled over those 3 years, the evidence of every hidden debt and mismanaged fund. What if I didn't fight? What if I let them think they'd won? Assuming all the assets without knowing the liabilities attached. Julia looked at me like I was walking away from a gold mine, but she didn't know the emotional toll how years of their quiet hatred had worn me down to where freedom meant more than any victory. Meanwhile, the small violations kept coming. My mother using my grandmother's old recipe box, the one she'd left specifically to me for a family potluck, without asking, then hesitating when I mentioned it, like she might keep it. Lauren repainted the office in drab gray, overwriting the warm tones I'd chosen after weeks of samples, symbolizing how they'd erase me piece by piece. One evening, as the transfer papers sat ready for signatures, Mike, the business partner, pulled me aside at a client event, his face serious. Are you sure about stepping back? This could blow up on them. He'd glimpsed some irregularities in the books I'd shared confidentially, but I just nodded, the weight of it all pressing in. My family celebrated prematurely that night, toasting David's new era, while I stood on the sidelines, their laughter a reminder of how invisible I'd become. But as I drove home to our small apartment in Austin's East Side, where Caleb and I were trying to hold things together amid the strain, I felt a shift, not triumph, but a resigned clarity that staying connected meant more pain. That night, after the family meeting where they'd casually announced stripping me of the business I'd essentially run for years, I got home to find Caleb waiting up, his face lined with worry, as he paced our cramped living room. We'd been together since we were kids, building a life that felt solid until my family's constant pull started fraying the edges, and now this latest blow had him questioning if we should cut ties altogether. But, as I recounted the conversation, my mother's matter-of-fact declaration, my father's averted gaze, my brother's smug acceptance, it all poured out in a rush, leaving me exhausted, yet strangely alert to the patterns I'd ignored for too long. The next morning, the pressure ramped up immediately. My mother called before I'd even finished my coffee, her voice clipped as she reminded me to hand over the client files by noon, adding that it was for the good of everyone, and implying I'd be selfish to drag my feet. I complied without argument, dropping them off at the office where David was already settling in like he'd earned it, his desk cluttered with my organized systems, now scattered, as if to mark his territory. Lauren hovered nearby, offering a fake sympathetic smile, while suggesting I take some time for myself, her words dripping with that passive jab that made it clear she saw me as the outsider in my own family's legacy. The small violations kept coming, each one twisting the knife a little deeper, like they were testing how much I'd take before breaking. A few days later, at Oliver's school soccer game, my parents showed up unannounced, cheering loudly for David, when he arrived late with some flashy new cleats for my son, completely overshadowing the fact that I'd been the one coaching him through practices. My father pulled me aside during halftime, his tone gruff, as he said, "Don't make this about you, Victoria. David's stepping up now, and we need unity, not your resentment." It was the first time he'd spoken directly about the transfer, but his words carried my mother's influence, that underlying authority they'd always wielded to keep me in line, making me feel like the perpetual second choice. Nora texted me right after asking how the game went, but when I mentioned the tension, she responded with vague support that felt hollow. Later confirmed when David referenced details from our chat in a family email chain about moving forward smoothly. Mike Thompson, our business partner, who'd seen the firm's ups and downs, called me privately that evening, his voice low as he warned that the debts were mounting faster than they'd admit. But I brushed it off, not ready to reveal my hand yet. Meanwhile, Amanda, Lauren's cousin, who'd become an unexpected ally after confiding in her about the documentation, met me for lunch and urged me to fight, her eyes fierce as she said, "They've always undervalued you, don't let them win this one too." As the weeks dragged on, the emotional coercion intensified, turning every interaction into a battlefield where my autonomy felt like it was slipping away. My mother started involving the extended family, calling my Uncle Frank to mediate what she framed as my unwillingness to let go, painting me as the obstacle to progress while conveniently omitting how their hidden loans had jeopardized everything. Frank, ever the neutral party, listened to her side first, and then reached out to me, his retired accountant's mind piecing together the discrepancies I'd shared years ago. But even he advised caution, saying, "Family ties run deep, but so do the consequences if you push back too hard." Oliver came home one afternoon, upset after a visit to my parents' house where they'd filled his head with stories about how David was saving the business and implying I'd been holding it back with my cautious approach, their way of isolating me further by turning my own son against me. He asked why I wasn't more involved anymore, his confusion breaking my heart, and when I tried to explain without bad-mouthing them, he pulled away, spending more time on his phone, likely texting David for the real story. Caleb noticed the shift too, our evenings turning tense as he pushed for us to distance ourselves, but I held back the weight of years of suppression, making me doubt if I could really break free without losing everything. The reputation hits came next, subtle at first, but escalating into something that threatened my whole sense of self. At a local real estate networking event I'd helped organize for years, my mother showed up with David in tow, introducing him as the new face of the firm. While barely acknowledging me, her smile tight as she whispered to a colleague that I was stepping back to focus on family. The jab landed hard, especially when the colleague, an old client I'd nurtured, nodded sympathetically but later emailed David directly for a deal we'd been working on together. Lauren amplified it on social media, posting photos of the family team at work with captions about fresh starts, conveniently cropping me out of group shots I'd been in. Nora, still playing the concerned friend, invited me out for drinks, but spent half the time fishing for details on my plans, her loyalty clearly divided since she'd always envied my role in the business. Even Sophia Drake, a new consultant David had hired to revamp marketing, someone I'd never met, but who quickly became part of their inner circle, started reaching out with condescending advice on transitioning gracefully, her messages laced with that professional polish that masked the family's directive to push me out entirely. It all built this suffocating sense of erasure, like they were rewriting our history to suit their narrative, leaving me questioning if I'd ever truly belonged. Julia, my lawyer, reviewed the transfer docs they'd sent, over her expression, turning grim as she pointed out the clauses that would saddle David with everything, including the undisclosed debts. "This is your out," she said, leaning forward in her office chair. "But only if you let them sign without a fight. They'll assume the liabilities, thinking it's a win." I nodded, the plan solidifying, but the moral entrapment gnawed at me. Was it right to let them dig their own grave, or was I just as bad for staying silent? The pressure peaked during a family dinner 2 months in, where my mother cornered me in the kitchen, her voice low and cutting. "Sign the release. Victoria, don't force us to make this public and drag your name through the mud." My father stood by the door, his presence a silent endorsement, while David joked from the dining room about expanding without dead weight. Oliver overheard his face paling, and later that night he asked if we were losing everything. The fear in his eyes a direct consequence of their games. Amanda, who'd joined the dinner at my quiet request, witnessed it all and pulled me aside afterward, her support unwavering as she said, "You've got the proof. Use it when the time's right, but protect yourself first." The isolation crept in slowly, my family's repeated demands chipping away at my social circle and sense of stability. Clients I'd built relationships with started routing through David, crediting him for deals I'd closed, and when I pushed back gently in one meeting, my mother shut it down with a sharp, "That's not your place anymore." Caleb and I argued more, the strain showing in how he'd come home late from his construction job, frustrated that I hadn't confronted them yet, but I needed time to ensure Oliver's trust was secure. Mike confided over coffee that the vendors were calling about overdue payments, hinting at lawsuits if things didn't turn around, but my parents dismissed his concerns when he brought it up, accusing him of disloyalty. Sophia, the new consultant, even emailed me a helpful article on letting go of control, her tone smug, as if she knew the family's secrets and relished her role in my demotion. Nora's betrayal solidified when she admitted over a tense call that she'd been sharing my vents to help smooth things, her excuse ringing hollow and leaving me without my closest confidant. As the final signing approached, the stakes escalated unpredictably, my family's authority clamping down harder. My mother scheduled a mediator session without my input, framing it as foreclosure, but it felt like a trap to force my compliance. During the call to confirm, she added a psychological jab. "You've always been the one to hold grudges. Let this go for Oliver's sake." David followed up with a text demanding access to my personal notes on ongoing projects, his impatience clear, while Lauren whispered during a drop-off that not everyone can lead, some are better supporting. Oliver started skipping family visits, telling me he didn't like the fighting, his withdrawal, a heartbreaking fallout from their coercion. Julia prepared the addendum detailing all liabilities, but as I reviewed it alone in our apartment, doubt hit. Could I really walk away, letting them face the collapse without warning? Frank called that evening, his voice urgent after crunching more numbers I'd sent, revealing even deeper holes, like unreported taxes that could trigger audits. The mini cliffhanger came the night before the signing, when Mike showed up at our door unannounced, documents in hand, and a grave look on his face. "They're pushing this through tomorrow," he said, glancing over his shoulder like he expected to be followed. "But if you don't stop it, the whole thing implodes, and they might drag you down with them." My mind raced as Mike stood in our doorway, the folder in his hand thick with printouts that mirrored the binders I'd hidden away, his unexpected visit forcing me to decide right then if I'd reveal the debts or let the signing proceed unchecked. He'd pieced together enough from his own access to know the firm was teetering, and his loyalty to me, as the one who'd kept things afloat, clashed with his stake in the business, leaving him torn between warning my family or backing my silence. But as we talked late into the night, Caleb joining us with coffee and pointed questions about why I hadn't blown it all open sooner, I realized the conversation was pulling me toward a choice that could either salvage scraps of connection or sever them forever. The next morning dawned with a heavy quiet, the Austin sun filtering through our blinds. As I drove to the mediator's office downtown, the signed release in my bag, feeling like a weight I both wanted and dreaded to unload. My family was already there when I arrived, my mother at the head of the conference table. With that authoritative poise, my father beside her, flipping through his phone, David and Lauren across from them, exchanging confident glances. Julia had prepped me on the addendum, the liability disclosure attached, like a quiet bomb, listing every mortgage, every maxed credit line, every vendor debt that would transfer solely to them once they claimed full ownership. The session started smoothly. The mediator, a neutral woman named Karen Walsh, outlining the terms as my mother nodded along, her voice steady when she said, "This is straightforward. Victoria's agreed to relinquish her claims, and we're ready to formalize David's leadership." My father murmured agreement, his eyes on the papers rather than me, while David leaned forward with a smirk, adding, "Yeah, let's get this done. No need to drag it out." Lauren squeezed his hand supportively, her presence a reminder of how they'd all aligned against me, but I kept my expression neutral, sliding the documents across without a word. As they reviewed, my mother's pen hovered, then signed, quickly passing it to my father, who followed suit, then David, who scribbled his name with flourish, the room filling with their relieved chatter about new beginnings. Julia cleared her throat, then drawing attention to the addendum, her tone professional as she explained, "This details all associated liabilities debts tied to the assets being transferred." My mother waved it off, saying sharply, "We've got it covered, no need to nitpick," and they initialed without a deep read, their impatience sealing the deal. The realization hit them piecemeal over the following weeks, starting with a call from a vendor demanding payment on an overdue invoice that David now owned solely, his confusion turning to frustration as he realized the depth of the hole. My mother confronted me first, showing up at our apartment unannounced, her face flushed as she accused me of hiding the truth, her words biting. "You knew about this and said nothing. How could you sabotage your own family?" My father trailed behind her, his silence now laced with regret. But when I calmly reminded them they'd demanded full control, she snapped back that I was always the difficult one, the child who'd never quite fit their vision. David blew up over the phone days later, blaming me for the frozen credit lines and looming lawsuits, his voice cracking with panic as Lauren yelled in the background about how I'd ruined their plans. Even Nora reached out, her tone shaky, as she admitted feeding them info in hopes of staying in their good graces, her betrayal fully exposed when she begged for understanding. But I ended the call without response, the isolation settling in like a necessary shield. Oliver overheard one of the arguments, his questions forcing me to explain gently that sometimes family meant setting boundaries to protect what mattered most, though his distant nods showed the rift had touched him too. The collapse unfolded faster than I'd anticipated, the firm's vendors filing claims that David couldn't dodge the office mortgage payments ballooning beyond their reach. My parents tried rallying the extended family for loans, my Uncle Frank fielding their desperate calls, but referring them back to the documents they'd signed, his quiet support for me, evident in how he declined to help. Mike pulled out his partnership stake early, citing irreconcilable differences. His parting words to me a hushed, You did what you had to, before he moved on to another firm. Sophia, the consultant they'd hired, jumped ship within a month, her polished reports useless against the financial avalanche, leaving David scrambling alone. Lauren's patience wore thin, their arguments spilling into family gatherings that I no longer attended, and soon enough whispers reached me through Amanda that their marriage was straining under the pressure. My mother attempted one last bridge, sending a text about talking things through for Oliver's sake. Her words a familiar guilt trip, but I replied simply that we'd manage without the finality of it echoing in the quiet that followed. In the end, I walked away with the modest settlement they'd offered a few $1,000s to cover basics, using it to enroll in project management courses at the local community college, a small step toward rebuilding on my own terms. The trust for Oliver remained secure his future, untouched by their mess, but the cost showed in how he spent more time at friends' houses, the family divide leaving him adrift. Caleb and I grew closer in the aftermath, our shared resolve strengthening us, though the loneliness crept in during quiet moments, the absence of what once was a constant ache. Amanda became a closer ally, her occasional check-ins a reminder that not all ties were toxic, but the broader isolation lingered, my parents' calls going unanswered, David's pleas ignored. There was no grand reckoning, no satisfying downfall to witness up close, just the quiet preservation of my sanity alone, in the space I'd carved out. The lesson hit hard. Sometimes choosing yourself means accepting the emptiness that follows a freedom laced with loss. Thank you for staying with me through this. It wasn't easy to share, but if you've ever faced family turning against you, know you're not alone. What boundaries have you set that changed everything? Share in the comments. I'd love to read your stories.